Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to New York. Welcome to the 28th edition of the World Law Congress. The World Law Congress was an idea envisioned by two great men, Charles Ryan, who was the president of the American Bar Association, and Chief Justice Earl Warren, that he led the Supreme Court for several decades and probably issued the most significant rules of the 20th century in the United States. He probably shaped the world. So these two men, they gathered in Washington at Chief Justice Earl Warren benches, and it was really the Cold War years, and they thought they had to do something to improve the world. And what they what they decided is that they wanted to mobilize the international legal community around just a simple but very difficult idea: to promote peace through law, to promote the rule of law as the only alternative to a rule of tyranny, to promote the rule of law as the only alternative to authoritarianism, and to ideologies, and that the societies are governed by rules, by laws, and not by families, and not by ideologies, and with a strong support and a strong focus in human dignity. So with these ideas, they started to mobilize the international legal community. The first World Law Congress took place in 1963 in Athens. In 1965, it was here in Washington, D.C. Well, sorry, not here in this country. And President Eisenhower, President Truman, President Lyndon B. Johnson greet and received at the White House, and Chief Justice Earl Warren organized a reception at the Supreme Court. So we're back here in the United States, where everything started. We are trying to follow the path that our predecessors started, and I'm really truly honored. I'm getting even a little bit emotional, because being next to such a figure as Leopoldo López, it means for me so many things. He's an inspirational man, not only or basically for what he has done around his life for freedom, not only in his country, but mainly in his country, but worldwide. And besides that, he's an extraordinary friend, great person. And here also his wife, Lilian Tintori, that is also a symbol and a figure that inspires us all to continue this work of promoting peaceful law, to promote freedom. So thank you very much, Leopoldo, for being here. Thank you, Lilian, for being here. I'm truly honored. And let's start the discussion if you want, Leopoldo.
No, thank you. Thank you, Diego. Thanks to all of you. I understand that the panel that we had planned for today it's been shortened, so I'll try to fill up with an experience of what the lack of rule of law means, and then talk about what we are doing. And I'll just give you a very brief background of who I am. My name is Leopoldo López. I am from Venezuela. I was mayor of Caracas, Venezuela, of a district of Chacao for 8 years, elected in 2000, re-elected in the year 2004. In the year 2008, I was running for higher office, and I was disqualified. It was the first political disqualification at the moment. I was going to win the governorship of Caracas, and I was banned to run for office and to do politics. I was banned from the legal system of Venezuela. So alongside with many other people, mainly young people from Venezuela, we started a civil resistance, nonviolent movement inspired by the civil rights movement of the United States and many other movements that have used nonviolence as a means to transition to democracy. In the year 2014, we called for protests in Venezuela, and tens of thousands of people went out to the streets. And there was a warrant for my arrest, and I decided to turn myself in February the 18th of 2014. And I did so very conscious of the fact that I was facing an unjust system. I was very conscious that what we were facing was the reality of a system that was not going to look for the rule of law, that was not going to look for the facts or for the proof, but for political motivations. So that led me to prison. I spent the next 4 years in a military prison, in the Ramo Verde prison near Caracas. And I was sentenced to a sentence of 14 years. The case that was closed, it was banned from the public, from observers, from NGOs, a case where I was not allowed to present one witness or one element of proof, while the dictatorship was able to present 150 witnesses and hundreds of elements of proof. The case that I was trialed for was a case of freedom of speech. I was sentenced to 14 years of prison for the interpretation of the judge that, although I never called for violence, I never called for confrontation, according to the judge, I had the capacity to send subliminal messages to the Venezuelan people for them to act in violent ways, with absolutely no elements of proof. My career facing an unjust system had started years before. In the year 2008, as I told you, I was disqualified to run for office, and I took my case to the Inter-American Human Rights Court in Costa Rica, in San Jose, Costa Rica. There's a, maybe that's a dictatorship. We're putting a fly here. We are not scared of flies or the dictatorship. No problem. I can deal with a fly. So in the year 2008, I took my case, and here we have one of the judges that listened to my case in San Jose, Costa Rica. It was a panel of 9 judges, and for the first time in the year 2012, I was able to be in front of impartial judges. I never asked for them to favor my case. I only asked to have the opportunity to see the facts and to rule according to the law. According to the constitution in Venezuela, nobody can be disqualified if there is not a definitive penal criminal sentence against that person. And that had not been the case in the proceeding against me. So the Inter-American Human Rights Court ruled in my favor in 2012. But the decision of the Chavez regime at the time was to leave the Inter-American human rights system. So they left the system. They did not take into consideration the decision of the Inter-American Human Rights Court, and I was unable to run for office. This is an interesting case because it was the first case in the human rights system that dealt with political rights. And the decision created a precedent. In the year 2012, there was a similar case, not in Venezuela, in 2013, not in Venezuela, but in Colombia. So at the time, another mayor, like myself, had been disqualified. And that mayor took his case to the Inter-American Human Rights Court. And the Inter-American Human Rights Court, using the decision that they had made the previous year in my favor, to rule in his favor. The name of this mayor is Gustavo Petro. So Gustavo Petro was able to go back to Colombia and be recognized with his political rights because of the decision of the Inter-American Human Rights Court. And that just goes to show the difference between Venezuela and Colombia. Colombia at the time had an institutional framework that, regardless of the political confrontation, ruled in favor of accepting the decision of the Inter-American Human Rights Court. That did not happen in Venezuela. Today, as we all know, Gustavo Petro is the president of Colombia, and he's the president of Colombia because he was able to run for office. And he was able to run for office because the Human Rights Court of Costa Rica allowed him to run for office, and the institutions in Colombia accepted that decision. That was not the case in Venezuela. This is a situation that has been prolonged in Venezuela. It has deepened. As I told you before, I went to prison. I spent 4 years in a military prison. Then I was taken to house arrest. From house arrest, I called for protest again, and they took me back to the military prison. Then they took me back to house arrest. And in April of 2019, I was able to escape house arrest and seek refuge at the Spanish embassy, where I stayed for a year and a half. At the end of 2020, I was able to escape Venezuela against my will. I never wanted to leave my country, but I had no other options. So that since then, I've been living in exile. But I want to go back briefly, because we're talking about the rule of law and the importance of institutions, to this issue of disqualifications, to this issue of banning candidates from running for office. Today, more than 10 years after what I told you, today the regime again is trying to ban the candidates, the leaders of the run-up for the presidential election that should take place in the year 2024 by using these disqualifications. There is a process of primaries, and the regime has decided to disqualify 3 of the front runners of that process. Enrique Capriles, Freddy Superlano, and Maria Corina Machado have all been disqualified to present their names as candidates. Recently, last week, the European Parliament made a decision to present their position against these political disqualifications, against the use of the law, of the judicial system for political reasons. La judicialización de la política. I don't know how you say that in English, using the courts to do politics. And that's exactly what is happening today in Venezuela. Unfortunately, in our country, we have no rule of law. There are judges. They wear robes. They have titles in their walls. They have secretaries, and they supposedly read the law. But there is no law in Venezuela, as there is no law in Cuba or Nicaragua or even Bolivia. In our continent, we are facing a rise of autocracies. It's spreading out throughout the continent. And the best way to identify this rise of autocracy is the manipulation of the rule of law. There cannot be democracy without the rule of law. My case is only one of thousands of Venezuela and elsewhere. So I believe that being here with jurists, with people who dedicate their lives, their professional efforts, and their commitment to the rule of law, I would call you to take a deep commitment with the situation under autocratic regimes. Since I left Venezuela in the year 2020, I decided, alongside with other leaders, not only from Latin America, but elsewhere, to create an alliance of pro-democracy leaders and movements. And we created the World Liberty Congress, which is an alliance of movements and activists from autocratic regimes, from Belarus, Russia, Zimbabwe, Chad, Iran, Iraq, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Hong Kong, China, the Uyghurs, and many others. We have joint efforts to confront what could be a very different situation from each one of our countries, because we are very different people. The religion that we profess, the skin, the color of our skin, the institutions of our country, the history of our countries. But when we talk about the confrontation and overcoming an autocratic regime, our stories are the same. So today we are in alliance with thousands of pro-democracy leaders and pro-democracy movements to promote 4 things. And one of them is the subject matter of this conference. 1, free and fair elections. 2, the respect for human rights. 3, the rule of law. And 4, which is the conclusion of the first 3, the promotion of democracy. So again, I thank the World Jurist Association, and I thank all of you for having commitment and for having an interest in the struggle that we are facing to transition to democracy. And I would like to end and open for questions, of course, and Diego, if you have any comments, giving you some facts about the 21st century. We are almost a quarter of a century into the 21st century. The 21st century has not seen a successful transition to democracy. The three cases that almost made a transition have rolled back to autocratic regimes: Egypt, Tunisia, and Bolivia. Beyond those cases, there has been no successful transition to democracy. The contrary is happening. We have seen 18 consecutive years, according to Freedom House, a rise in autocratic regimes and a decline of democracies around the world. Anna Applebaum, Pulitzer Prize winner, wrote a year ago an article, said that the bad guys are winning. And in her framing, she talks about how autocratic regimes are working together, regardless of ideology. It's not an issue of left, right, conservative, liberal. It's much more basic. It's about power. It's about holding on to power. It's the alliance of the Communist Party of China with the nationalists of Russia, with the conservative mullahs of Iran, and with the kleptocratic regime of Venezuela or Nicaragua. No ideology. It's all about power. It's all about kleptocracy. And it's all about dismantling the rule of law, which they manipulate in their task to become, to be in power for as long as they can. So again, thank you, Diego. Thanks to the World Jurists for this opportunity. And if you have any questions, more than happy to answer them.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Leopoldo, for sharing your experience with us. I am a Guatemala former jurist. I've been in exile for 10 years. Maybe you didn't mention Guatemala, but
I'm a Guatemala jurist in exile. You didn't mention Guatemala, but Guatemala is a dictatorship of corruption. What you're describing resonates with me, is what is happening right now. There are elections, but they're using the judicial system to get some people out of the election. So you have said, you know, how China, Russia, and other countries are helping small democracies or weak democracies to take control of the institution of democracy. So how can, you know, these states that where the rule of law is respect could help small countries or countries that are facing these threats strengthen their institutions?
Well, it's I mean, we've been dealing with this in the case of Venezuela for over 25 years. The first years were very difficult because at the time there was a mirage of a different type of democracy. I remember the times when people in the United States and Europe talked about Venezuela as a tropical democracy, a democracy of the Caribbean. Well, a democracy that was given to the people. Well, what happened in my country is that we had what could have been a blessing became a curse. The price of oil went from $15 per barrel to $150 per barrel. And that created a mirage. It created an illusion that things were getting better in Venezuela. But in the meantime, media was being shut down, TV channels were being closed, expropriations were happening, leaders were being thrown into prison, and over a gradual period of time, the institutions were killed. So democracy in Venezuela was killed from within. Chavez won an election. He rightfully won an election in the year 1998. But then gradually, he took control of the institutions. The first thing that happened in Venezuela, and that was the beginning of the end, and I'll get to Guatemala, that was the beginning of the end in Venezuela, happened very early. The promise of Chavez was a constituent assembly to change the constitution, to change the institutional framework, and to promise to the people that all of the problems of the Venezuelan people were going to be solved through a new constitution. You were going to have a house, education, funding, pensions. There were going to be trains, highways, a good police force, a good healthcare system with a new constitution. The illusion of a new constitution creating a new republic, as it was said during our independence years. These fictional republics were created through this promise. And in 1999, we had a constituent assembly in Venezuela, and everything changed. We went from the 3 powers of Montesquieu to 5. They included the moral power and the electoral power. They changed the institutional framework, and also, more importantly, they changed the people leading the institutions in Venezuela. So the lawyer of Chavez became the attorney general. The people close to him were packed the Supreme Court. And the institutions were already set to dismantle democracy from within. It didn't happen from one day to another. It was a gradual process. But today, when we look back, the beginning of that process started with the killing of the rule of law, with a process that even in the electoral framework created an illusion, because they killed the proportional representation for that constituent assembly. So Chavez, with 54% of the vote, he had 96% of the members of the constituent assembly. So he created this illusion of a supermajority, and everything started to change. And then, as I said, the blessing turned into curse. That was the price of oil, extended for a long period of time the situation of Venezuela. Today, we are clearly a dictatorship, and it took more than 15 years for the Venezuelan people and the international community to recognize that Venezuela was no longer a democracy. The break point happened in the year 2014 when we called for protests. And after that moment, the Venezuelan people and the world saw the ugly face of Maduro and his repression machine. Students being killed, people being repressed, hundreds of people being detained, thousands of people being detained, hundreds of people becoming political prisoners. So that was a before and an after. After that point, it became clear that Venezuela was no longer a democracy. But the situation continues. Today, I see that there are signs of what happened in Venezuela in many other places in Latin America, Guatemala being one of them. I see some of the things that are happening in Colombia, similar to what we saw in Venezuela many years ago. I see some of the promises in other parts of the continent being similar to what happened in Venezuela. But with respect to countries that are clearly autocratic, we can talk about, at least in my understanding, 4 countries in Latin America: Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia. And we include Bolivia because Bolivia is under the radar about their autocratic processes. There are more than 300 political prisoners in Bolivia. Luis Fernando Camacho, the governor of Santa Cruz, is today in prison. He's isolated. He cannot receive visits beyond his direct family. He's taken away from his home country in Santa Cruz to to La Paz, and he's become a symbol with others of political prisoners in Bolivia. I believe that if there is one political prisoner, we cannot talk about a democracy. So that is the situation that we are living in these 4 countries. But unfortunately, if the rule of law does not uphold itself, this situation can become a reality in many other countries in our continent.
I have a technical question that underlies a broader question. The World Liberty Congress, have you been officially recognized around the world? What are governments doing to support your work? And how supportive is the United States being?
Well, it's been recognized by the activists, which is the most important. We have received support from different organizations. The World Jurist is one of our partners. We had our first event in Lithuania, in Vilnius. Last November, we gathered 188 leaders from 44 countries. And there are different organizations that have been supporting us. The Lithuanian government has partnered with us. The Lithuanian parliament has partnered with us in promoting this initiative of bringing together those who are in the front lines in the struggle for freedom. And I can tell you that this is no easy fight. It's not an easy fight because it's a very lonely fight. And many times we find ourselves not only confronting the autocracies, but many times confronting the indifference of democratic countries that, because of geopolitical or economic interests, have put the priority of democracy and rule of law in the bottom part of the priority list. I am seeing that with my home country, Venezuela. Today, it seems that for the American and the European free nations, it's more important to talk about the energy stability that Venezuela could provide to the continent, or to stabilize the dictatorship in order to contain migration. 2 flawed premises, in my view, above the importance of promoting a transition to democracy. And that is why we are getting together. That is why we don't want to be a single voice. That is why we understand that bringing people from Hong Kong, from Iran, from Russia, Belarus, Zimbabwe, and many other countries together, we can have a more compelling argument for freedom, for human rights, for democracy, if we believe that these are values that should be universal. I believe that they should be universal. I didn't know what freedom was until I was sent into prison. I didn't know what the importance of the rule of law until I went through the process that I described over the past minutes. So I believe, truly believe, that these are universal values that have no borders. And that is why I support greatly this effort of the World Jurist Association to talk about the rule of law and also the importance of democracy and human rights as part of the rule of law. Yes.
Hola Leopoldo, buenos días, gracias por estar aquí. La última vez que te vi, yo soy venezolana también, y en mi memoria estaba cuando estabas en Plaza Chacaíto, tratando de que Venezuela tuviese esa libertad que todos ansiamos. Vivo en España, tengo 8 años en España, pero ansío esa libertad, ansío volver a mi país y que se desarrolle. ¿Qué hace falta? ¿Qué se necesita? ¿Hay esperanza de que este cambio se dé? Porque yo todavía la tengo, pero siento que estamos como un poco estancados.
Well, the question is, she's from Venezuela, and she asked me if we have hope for transition to democracy and what needs to be done. And I tell you, I believe that there is always hope. That is the one thing we cannot let go. And that might sound like a slogan, but it's not. In the end, if you lose hope, you don't have the will to wake up every day and fight for what you believe. And I have hope because the Venezuelan people want change. And this is something that it's very clear by any way we try to measure. Opinion polls, the streets, talking to the people, more than 9 of 10 Venezuelans want change. However, what we want is a free and a fair election. We have been struggling for a free and fair election for many, many years. And that continues to be our struggle. There is an election that could take place next year. And I say that it could take place next year because there is no date for that election yet. And the dictator Maduro has said that he can call for the election in 2023 or he can call for the election in 2025 as he desires. Now we are in a process where there is a new moment of people mobilizing in the streets, not massively, but it's the beginning of a new cycle. At least this is my understanding. We are seeing the candidates in the streets doing their job. We are seeing different candidates. We're seeing Enrique Capriles, Freddy Superlano, Maria Corina Machado, and others going to the streets and appealing to the people. And we are hoping to have a primary. However, the threat that we are facing is a threat of the rule of law, because there is information that the regime could decide through the Supreme Court next week or in the following weeks, could put a decision to dismantle the primaries under the arguments that a primary process that is not being controlled by the electoral system of the regime is illegal. So we might be in the upcoming weeks facing a very difficult scenario where that hope that we are putting on the electoral path, on the people, in order to create a new cycle of mobilizing, a new cycle of legitimizing the opposition in Venezuela, that might face a decision of the unjust Supreme Court of Venezuela. And we will see how to overcome that new obstacle. But it's very clear that we are facing a ruthless autocracy that is not alone. For many years, people said Maduro is alone. Maduro is no longer supported by the US or by Europe. But that goes to show that we have a narrow understanding of what the international community is. Because one thing is the international community of the free world. And another thing is to talk about the international community at a global level. At a global level, Maduro has more support than we do from the free countries, because Maduro has the support from China, from Russia, from Iran, from Turkey, from Cuba, from Belarus. And that support translates into funding, diplomatic support at the UN right here, a couple of blocks away. They have 2 veto votes in the UN Security Council. They support with cybersecurity, with their manipulation of the social media, with the irregular groups, La FARC, ELN, Cartel de Sinaloa, Hezbollah, Grupo Wagner. They are all in Venezuela. We've been saying this for years, but for many times they said that we were exaggerating for propaganda purposes. Now it's clear to all of the institutions, to reporters, that these non-state armed groups are in Venezuela with the support of these mighty powers that are supporting Nicolás Maduro. So seeing the conflict in this context takes us to a difficult conclusion, but it's the only one, in my view, that this is not only an issue that Venezuelans can confront by themselves. Yes, we will be at the front lines, but this is an issue that goes beyond Venezuela because it's a global struggle. Because when we are facing Maduro, we are also facing Putin, Xi Jinping, and the autocratic regimes that are willing to go beyond limits to support and to take a hold on power. So what do we appeal to? Who do we appeal to? Well, we appeal to the free nations. We appeal to the governments of the free nations, to the people of the free nations, to the people all over the world who want freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. And we need to understand that the state of the world today is one when we are losing that conflict. Every year, year by year, there are more autocratic regimes in the world. Every year, there are less democracies. Every year, democracies are less functioning according to the respect for the rule of law and human rights. So there is always hope, but there cannot be hope without a fight. The only way that we can materialize that hope is if we are willing to fight the fight for freedom. It's not free. Freedom is not free. Freedom requires commitment, and it requires support, and it requires engagement at all different levels. Yes.
Hello. I'm coming from Germany. My name is Sadullah Altuntaş. And actually, I am also in exile. I'm a citizen of Turkey, and I'm in Germany for 6 years now. And at the first part of your speech, you mentioned the authoritarian regimes, and you didn't mention Turkey at that part. But we need to mention that Turkey is recognized as hybrid country, hybrid regime recently. And it is actually a bit tricky about Turkey because when it is in the middle of just the frontier of European Union, and we have elections in like a few months ago. And the first presidents, people who congratulate Erdogan was the European leaders. So, and because of the refugee crisis and the human rights infringements in Turkey are not recognized well enough in European Union, and we are striving for this in Germany overall. But the problem goes beyond, because in Turkey, as you said, there are elections, but they are not fair and free. And also, it becomes a part of the regime, the discourse. The opposition is not actually the opposition. They are repeating the discourse and the rhetoric of the ruling party. And from outside, it seems that there's elections and he won with 52%, but it was not a fair, it was far from being a fair election. And there are many human rights infringements, and we are really working hard to make them known by in European cities in all over the world. I know it is far from Venezuela and Turkey, but Maduro is a good friend of Erdogan, as you know, as you mentioned already. So I think that solidarity between, even if it is where we are far, solidarity between institutions, NGOs, together with the European institutions on human rights as well, is very crucial in this process. And I would like to thank you also for your efforts to raising the voice of this.
Thank you very much. And the case of Turkey, as you say, is considered today a hybrid regime. They are part, we have members of Turkey in the World Liberty Congress, and I will give you more information. And as you say, Turkey has been instrumental for Maduro. And I'll give you an example. Turkey has been involved in the extraction of blood gold from Venezuela. The Venezuelan regime has been destroying the Amazonia. If the most direct attack to the environment in the Western Hemisphere is happening in Venezuelan territory for the extraction of gold. Massive amounts of land are being destroyed in order to extract gold. And Turkey has helped Maduro to take the gold out of Venezuela, take it to Turkey, refine it, and then put it into the market. It has been reported by different news agencies, and it's very clear that there is not only a diplomatic support, but also economic support on the part of Turkey. I understand the complexities of Turkey in the middle of the war because it's playing a crucial role right now with NATO and lifting the veto over the inclusion of Finland to NATO. So Turkey, for geopolitical reasons right now, is very important for the war effort. However, that does not take away the fact that there is an autocratic development happening in your country. And what we hope is to bring together all of these movements. So I'll give you an idea that we are working on, and we can talk about this later. Next year, during the spring of 2024, we want to call for a global rally against autocrats and for freedom. So if you're in Berlin, you can organize all of the people from Turkey, but maybe the people from Africa or Latin America that are there. So what we have in mind is to have a global rally in the cities of the world where people rally against their dictators and all together against dictators and for freedom. And I think that if we are true to the commitment of these values, human rights, rule of law, democracy, and free and fair elections, we need to go out and unify our efforts in order to make our voices much stronger than what they are today. Because what we face today is the exact same challenge that you had a couple minutes ago, trying to explain audiences what is happening in your country, and not everybody is sufficiently informed. So during that period, we continue to lose democracy, to lose rule of law, and that's why we are uniting our efforts. Is this the only thing that needs to be done in order to overcome autocracies? No, we need the support of governments. We need the support of companies in the sense of not engaging with these regimes economically. We need the support of the media, of the journalists, but we need to start somewhere, and that's where we are starting, from the front line, from our space as activists and as grassroots leaders.
No, I wanted to share, sorry, yes, before finishing, sorry, excuse me, sir. No, briefly, I think it's very important, Leopoldo, what you are doing. I had the opportunity to be in New York 1.5 years ago, more or less, when you started the Ally, the Freedom Fighters. And when we were there, we were discussing that, for instance, when Chief Justice Warren or when Winston Churchill or Charles Ryan decided to promote the World Jurist Association, somehow, Leopoldo, the enemies were more clear. And it was the Communist Party and the Western democracies, more or less. But now, and I think, or at least that's what I am understanding from your speech and your ideas, is that somehow autocracy sometimes is not so clear, and people don't have clear ideas about whether if they are good or they are wrong. No, besides 50 years ago or 60 years ago, it was more clear. So when I met your team and your group in New York, in this city, you were talking about the international alliance, how the autocracies are allied against Western democracies, and how they are not confronting openly. They say that they promote rule of law a lot of times, and that they promote independence of justice. So sometimes nowadays the enemy is even more dangerous because they attack within democracy, as it happens in Venezuela. You explained very well, gradually, and at the end, that's because that's why I think sometimes people are somehow indifferent, because they think it's not really such a strong enemy as, for instance, it was the Nazism or the communism, and that's a shame. And I think we should all focus. It's not about left or right. It's not a bipartisan idea. It's basically rule of law and human dignity.
Oh, absolutely. I think that a lot has happened since the fall of the Berlin Wall. At the time, the idea was that democracy and the market economy had won, and that it was just a matter of time to roll out democracy all over the world. And now when we look back 30 years ago, the world evolved in a very different way. It looks nothing like what people expected during the early 1990s. During that time, looking to the future was looking to a democratic future. And that's what led to the type of globalization that the world engaged after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that gave China, for example, great independence to go into the global markets. And the thinking of many people was, with a strong economy in China and a strong middle class in China, that will have an effect of trickle-down democracy, that it will become more democratic because a strong middle class and a strong economy will naturally lead to democracy. Now we know that that is not true, and that autocracy can coexist with market economy. They can even be better in the management of a market economy in certain ways, but that has nothing to do with the fact of respecting human rights, rule of law, and the basic idea that people elect who should be their governors. So yes, it's not as clear, but I think that the war in Ukraine has made it at least central to the discussion, that there is a conflict between autocracy and democracy. I truly believe that there is a lot more to do, and that there is a lot more to explain of what you were saying, Diego, of the collaboration among autocratic regimes, because it's not just a rise of autocracies throughout the world. It's the fact that they are collaborating, that they are learning from each other, that they are supporting each other, that they are looking to dismantle the democratic nations together. And it's not an open plan. They don't have a building called the Autocracy Inc. in Moscow or in Beijing. They don't have the UN for autocracy. But when you look at, for example, the voting patterns here at the UN, it's very interesting. And I started to look at this in the case of Venezuela. And then I started to look at other cases of Nicaragua, Cuba, Iran, and other places. And when there is a vote against those regimes for condemning violations of human rights or women's rights in the case of Iran or any other case, you see that there is an alignment of these like-minded countries, as they call themselves, in their voting. And when you listen to their speeches justifying their votes, it's as if they do copy-paste. So you have Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Belarus, Eritrea, having the exact same arguments for a case in Venezuela or in Nicaragua or in other countries. So this is happening. This is something that it's not a conspiracy theory. This is a reality. There is organization, there is coordination in order to dismantle democracy as a way to organize societies and countries around the world. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Lawrence Moss. I'm one of the representatives of this bar association to the UN, and I've had previous jobs representing, at one point, Amnesty International, and another time, Human Rights Watch at the UN. On your point about the diplomatic alliance between the autocracies, I really want to note the failure of Latin American democracies to mobilize against the candidacies of some of the autocracies in Latin America for UN bodies. So, for example, in 2019, Venezuela was shockingly elected to the UN Human Rights Council, largely because for a long time, only it and Brazil were running for the 2 seats that were available. At the last minute, Costa Rica entered the race, but it was too late to overcome the commitments that Venezuela had obtained. Fortunately, it mobilized otherwise in 2022. Latin America and Costa Rica did defeat Venezuela that year, but it took 3 years. Also, the Latin American democracies have always ceded the control of the Latin American seats on the NGO committee of ECOSOC, which accredits NGOs to many of the autocratic states. And Cuba and Nicaragua continue to serve on the NGO committee, and which regularly, rejects the applications of human rights NGOs for ECOSOC accreditation and the ability to participate at the UN. So there's really a much more, it's important that Latin American democracies be mobilized much more strongly on this, because as you say, these countries are not merely members, but Cuba in particular is very, very able in a diplomatic level in the way they behave at the Human Rights Council. They know the rules very, very, very well. They're regularly elected. And Venezuela also was a very destructive force during the 2 years it served on the council. So I think it's really important to look at those alliances and states prioritize defeating the autocracies when they run for these bodies.
No, you're absolutely right. And we have seen that not only in Latin America. Iran was recently elected for the Human Rights Council. And actually, not only that they were elected, but the week that they were going to take their seat, they sponsored an exposition of the history of women in Iran. So in Geneva, at the Human Rights Council, Iran, this is after the protests that took place for months because of the compulsory hijab and the killing and the execution and the hanging of hundreds of people. So there was in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, Iran as a member of the Human Rights Council presenting to all of the other participants an exposition of the dresses, the Persian and the historical dresses. And the name of that exposition was Women in the History of Iran. What they failed to do was to put women under the compulsory hijab. And what they failed to do is to talk about the way in which they want to hide women and forbid women from going to have the rightful education or job opportunities. So yes, this is happening and we are very aware of this. And as you very well say, in the case of Latin America, but beyond, Cuba has been instrumental in the dealings of this internal rule manipulation or going through the cracks of the UN system. The same thing has happened with the OAS. The OAS has been taken over by what was the petrodiplomacy of Chavez. What did Chavez do? Well, the Caribbean countries had a historical problem with energy. They don't have oil. So in order to have energy, they need to import, gas oil, and it's very, very expensive. So for years, Chavez would give subsidized fuel to the Caribbean countries and created petrodiplomacy to secure the votes at the OAS. So in the OAS, as in the UN, one country, one vote, and we had a reality that for many, many years, the countries at the OAS, as it happened at the UN Human Rights Council, they were voting in favor of Venezuela, and many times they were not allowing for issues to come to the table and to the discussion, issues that had to do with free and fair elections and with the defense of human rights. So I agree with you on one of the things that we want to do. We are not governments. We are democracy defenders from the front lines. One of the things that we want to do is work within these institutions. So I was invited in March of this year to Geneva by an NGO called UN Watch. And I had 1 minute and 30 seconds to talk, as the NGOs have after the countries talk. And after my 90-second speech, the Venezuelan delegation started a process to sanction UN Watch and take them out of their possibility to continue to invite different voices to the UN Council. So they are very articulated, not only at the diplomatic spheres, but also at the economic spheres, the military spheres, the non-state armed group spheres, and the kleptocratic webs, because this is one of the things that we need to be very aware. This is all about corruption in the end. It's all about stealing the money and the resources of the people. Venezuela, that was the fourth largest economy in South America, today has a GDP per capita similar to Haiti. So the country collapsed. 80% of the GDP of Venezuela collapsed over the past 10 years. However, the kleptocratic regime has taken hold of the cash flow that comes from the cocaine trafficking, the gold extraction, the opaque and corrupt sale of gold, contraband, and other illicit activities. And that's what we are facing, not only in Venezuela, but many other countries. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Daniela Vasquez, and
Not working? Miss,
Ahora.
you want to? No,
En esto. No.
This is the last question, okay?
Hi, good morning. My name is Daniela Vasquez. I'm advisor for the Permanent Observer Mission for the International Youth Organization for Upper America to the United Nations. My question is, what role can international cooperation and multilateral organizations can play in democracy and upholding the rule of law in Venezuela?
Well, I think that the opening. So my first question is being coherent with what their statements have been approved. So you have, for example, the OAS, you have the Carta Democrática, the Inter-American Charter, and it talks about the commitment of all of the countries in the American continent to democracy, to rule of law, and to free and fair elections. And according to that agreement that was signed by all of the countries in September of 2001, there would be sanctions or there would be pressure from countries that are democratic to those that are not. But that is not happening. So we see a lot of appeasement in international organizations. We see a lot of turning the shoulder from some organizations. Not all, I need to say. I would like to make the case of the importance of the International Criminal Court. In that case, Venezuela today is going through a process. 8,900 victims presented their individual cases in the International Criminal Court against the dictatorship of Maduro. It's a slow process. We don't know what the exact outcome is going to be, but it's something that we need to. It's something that we need to do. And I believe that the international organizations should be open to listening not only to governments, but also to democracy defenders and to civil society and to alternative voices, because that many times is not happening. Thank you.
you.
Sí.